Welcome to the Tertulia with Tom Beckley on Wendell Berry, presented by Tertulias Fredericton in partnership with the MB Media Co-op, Raven, and the Tobic River Trading Company on September 23rd, 2020.
Hello and welcome. My name is Christy Elaine. I'm a sociologist at St. Thomas University, and on behalf of the Tertulia Organizing Committee of Tracy Glynn, Daniel Tubb, and Matthew Hayes, we want to warmly welcome you to the first Tertulia of the fall season. We want to remind you that you can ask questions as the Tertulia proceeds, and you can do that in the chat. And I'll turn it over to Daniel Tubb to introduce our speaker this evening. Thank you.
Everyone, I'm Daniel Tom, and I have the pleasure of introducing Tom Beckley, his Tertulia on Wendell Berry. So Tom is a professor in the School of Forestry and Environmental Management. He's an environmental and natural resources sociologist. I've always thought of him as a rural sociologist, but I clarified that today. And I've known Tom for the last 4 years here at UNB, and he's become a good friend and a good mentor. We've organized lots of events together, and one of those events was my own introduction to Wendell Berry, a talk that Phil Tabor gave a few years ago. And I then proceeded to go and read pretty much everything I could get my hands on by Wendell Berry. He's been an inspiration, so I'm ecstatic that Tom will be giving us a tertulia on Wendell Berry, his thoughts, his ideas. And with that, I think I have not much else to say other than Tom is great. He works on rural issues. There's a really cool project we're part of on smart climate forestry. Lots of things to ask about, but today's talk is really about Wendell Berry. So take it away, Tom.
Okay, thanks very much. And I haven't been an active participant at these, partly because of past conflicts that I've had in the past. So I rescheduled my class this year for the morning instead of evening, so I could show up to some of these. So I really want to congratulate the organizers. I think this type of event is exactly what should go on in university towns everywhere, really. But I always felt that the culture in Fredericton didn't have as much of this sort of thing as it ought to, and so kudos to you for pulling this together. So I'm going to talk about Wendell Berry, and I'm going to talk about it in a fairly personal way. He's been a big influence on me for the last 40 years. So I'll introduce who he is, essentially. You see at the bottom, like a lot of people either love him or they've never heard of him. I haven't met many people that have read his work and just kind of not had a strong opinion or didn't like it. So I'll just kind of briefly touch on some of his ideas and some of his works, and read a couple of passages from works from quite a long time ago and some more recently. But also share some stories along the way, and then we'll open it up for a general discussion. That's all right. And if people have questions along the way, fire away and someone will let me know that there's a question. So Wendell was born in 1934, so he's exactly the same age as my mother. He was born in Henry County, Kentucky, and I think that's still the county where he lives, although he lived in New York for a while and so forth. Now, I was born across the Ohio River. I was born in Cincinnati a generation later, and but I point that out just because we kind of come from the same place. I only lived there until I was 3, but we kind of come from the same cultural ecosystem, let's say. His dad was a lawyer, but also a farmer, and Wendell has kind of kept that tradition of being a writer and also a farmer. He got degrees in the arts at the university, in English, and like I said, he taught in New York City for a little while, but then returned to Kentucky and had 2 different stints teaching at the University of Kentucky from 1965 to 77, and then again a few years later. I sort of speculate that in 1965, when he returned, he bought his 117-acre farm, and I I sort of jokingly suggest that maybe he went back for a second teaching stint because he needed off-farm income to support the farm, which is the way that often goes with small farms in the latter 20th century and today. So I'm not going to go through this whole list, but Wendell Berry is a bit of a darling of the left, and ironically, the urban left, I think. And some of his activism, largely activism through writing, has gone back to the Vietnam War, anti-nukes, U.S. militarism, agriculture policy, death penalty, and then most recently, he's been quite active, and this list was quite a bit longer, around coal and coal mining in Kentucky, and particularly mountaintop removal. He was part of a group that occupied the governor's office for a while, and then I also read that he just he removed his letters, like his collection of his letters, and I think original manuscripts and so forth, was at the University of Kentucky, and he had them removed from there because of their friendliness to big coal. As for his ideas, again, it's a bit ironic that I think, like, progressive lefty urban elite types love Wendell Berry, and I probably fit that characterization myself. But he represents something that's quite the opposite of that. The importance of place, staying in place, connecting to a place. He's all about agriculture and agrarianism, and I'll read what his definition of agrarianism is a little bit later. He's very concerned about the place of agriculture in culture, and the other book that I'll read from 1977 is really a scathing critique of kind of industrial agriculture and agribusiness. And generally, his take on agrarianism is that he contrasts it to what he calls industrial thinking. And in that is woven lots of writing about ethics and character, care, like duty to care, stewardship, and sustainability and responsibility. And then he feels that these things, right relations with nature and right relations with people and community are really inextricably interwoven. With nature, he talks a lot about consumerism and waste. Like waste is ultimately, he ties it back to wasting land, which he thinks is a crime and a sin. And then, he's been an advocate for rural people, and argues that the flow of value from urban to rural is something that's it's been a bit of a one-sided relationship, really, since the beginning of the United States. So the first work I want to speak about briefly this was the first book that I read. It was written in 1969. I read it in 1979, or no, 1980. The map is just a bit of a joke there, like showing the Northwest Territory, the original Northwest Territory. But it's to point out that in Ohio, where I was born, it was on the other side of the Ohio River from where Wendell Berry was born, and that technically makes me a northerner and him a southerner, and that's something that he's struggled with and grappled with a little bit in his own writing, sort of being grouped in with a group of Southern writers, and people make assumptions about what that means you're an apologist for, and he's had to do some defense of the South in a way through that. But The Long-Legged House, so it was given to me by my father's mentor. My dad was an architect. His nickname was Big City Bob. And after being born in Cincinnati, I moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and then Milwaukee, where I mostly grew up. So, like, why this guy had such an appeal for me when I first read him when I was 19 is still a little bit of a mystery. Perhaps it was my way of rebelling against my parents, but my dad's mentor, this guy Ray Rausch, was a wonderful man, and also from that area in Southern Ohio. He did grow up in a small town in Southern Ohio, he gave me this book, The Long-Legged House, and I really don't remember much from that particular book. But the title story about the long-legged house is the one thing I remember. And basically, he describes a style of vernacular architecture in the Ohio Valley. People who lived right on the river basically built their house on stilts. They would park their car underneath. It was good for cooling. And then obviously when the Ohio River flooded, which it frequently did, people were safe and dry and their belongings weren't damaged. And this kind of, I don't know, like basic rural pragmatism is kind of what Wendell Berry is all about. Rivers are going to do what rivers are going to do. They're going to flood. And so the prudent thing to do for people is to arrange our lives so that's the least disruptive that it can possibly be. People still want to live near water and live near the river. That's fine, but you do it on nature's terms. That's, I think, maybe the way he would express it. So unfortunately, in the half century since that book was published, all we've done as a culture in North America is build in floodplains and build in floodplains and build in floodplains, and not on stilts. And clearly, we've had that experience here in Fredericton in the last 3 years. That it's not a good idea. So I was inspired enough by The Long-Legged House that I immediately dove into The Unsettling of America, which had just been published 3 years earlier. And in some ways, this work, I think it's his most famous work. In some ways, it seems a little bit dated. It sort of came out of the Cold War, and he talks about Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz and Richard Nixon and food as a weapon and trying to outproduce Soviet Russia and the Soviet Union. And in terms of food, he steps on conservation groups' toes a little bit. And again, the environmental movement was barely a decade old at that time. But in other ways, this critique of sort of modern culture and agriculture, it still really works. I still assign these 3 chapters of this book in my grad seminar, and the students just eat it up. It's still very relevant today. So I just want to read a passage from this, and it's a little bit long, but I think you'll enjoy it. The disease of modern character is specialization. Looked at from the standpoint of the social system, the aim of specialization may seem desirable enough. The aim is to see that the responsibilities of government, law, medicine, engineering, agriculture, education, etc., are given into the hands of the most skilled, best prepared people. The difficulties do not appear until we look at specialization from the opposite standpoint, that of individual persons. We then begin to see the grotesquerie, indeed the impossibility of an idea of community wholeness that divorces itself from any idea of personal wholeness. The first and best known hazard of the specialist system is that it produces specialists, people who are elaborately and expensively trained to do one thing. We get into absurdity very quickly here. There are, for instance, educators who have nothing to teach, communicators who have nothing to say, medical doctors skilled at expensive cures for diseases that they have no skill and no interest in preventing. More common and more damaging are the inventors, manufacturers, and salesmen of devices who have no concern for the possible effects of those devices. Specialization is thus seen to be a way of institutionalizing, justifying, and paying highly for a calamitous disintegration and scattering out of the various functions of character: workmanship, care, conscience, and responsibility. Even worse, a system of specialization requires the abdication to specialists of the various competencies and responsibilities that were once personal and universal. Thus, the average, one is tempted to say the ideal, American citizen now consigns the problem of food production to agriculturalists and agribusinessmen. The problems of health to doctors and sanitation experts, the problems of education to school teachers and educators, the problems of conservation to conservationists, and so on. The supposedly fortunate citizen is therefore left with only 2 concerns: making money and entertaining himself. He earns money typically as a specialist, working an 8-hour day at a job for the quality or consequences of which somebody else, or perhaps more typically nobody else, will be responsible. And not surprisingly, since he can do so little else for himself, he is even unable to entertain himself, for there exists an enormous industry of exorbitantly expensive specialists whose purpose is to entertain him. The beneficiary of this regime of specialists ought to be the happiest of mortals, or so we are expected to believe. All of his vital concerns are in the hands of certified experts. He is a certified expert himself, and as such, he earns more money in a year than all of his great-grandparents together. Between stints at his job, he has nothing to do but mow his lawn with a sit-down lawnmower or watch other certified experts on television. At supper time, he may eat a tray of ready-prepared food, which he and his wife, also a certified expert, procure at the cost only of money, transportation, and the pushing of a button. For a few minutes between supper and sleep, he may catch a glimpse of his children, who since breakfast have been in the care of education experts, basketball and marching band experts, or perhaps legal experts. The fact is, however, that this is probably the most unhappy average citizen in the history of the world. He has not the power to provide himself with anything but money, and his money is inflating like a balloon and drifting away, subject to historical circumstances and the power of other people. From morning to night, he does not touch anything that he has produced himself, in which he can take pride. For all his leisure and recreation, he feels bad, he looks bad, he is overweight, his health is poor, his air, water, and food are all known to contain poisons. There's a fair chance that he will die of suffocation. He suspects that his love life is not as fulfilling as other people's. He wishes that he had been born sooner or later. He does not know why his children are the way they are. He does not understand what they say. He does not care much and does not know why he does not care. He does not know what his wife wants or what he wants. Certain advertisements and pictures in magazines make him suspect that he is basically unattractive. He feels that his possessions are under threat of pillage. He does not know what he would do if he lost his job, if the economy failed, if the utility companies failed, if the police went on strike, if the truckers went on strike, if his wife left him, if his children ran away, or if he should be found to be incurably ill. And for these anxieties, of course, he consults certified experts, who in turn consult certified experts about their anxieties. So that kind of grabbed me. And the rest of the book, as I said, is kind of a scathing critique of the industrialization of agriculture and specifically land-grant universities, the agro-industrial complex, as described. He also, in the book, talks a great deal about community and democracy, and like he does have a very Jeffersonian ideal of democracy that begins at the local level and bubbles up, and that strong nations really come from strong communities and people connected to land. And again, what ties it all together is this sense of care, nurture, contributing to your community and not exploiting. So I was 19 years old when I read this in 1980, and it stopped me in my tracks. I had been a student for 1 year at Bowdoin College, and I didn't have the best of times there. And this totally, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should go back there or what I should do. So I wrote Wendell Berry a letter, and what do you know? He wrote me back. I would probably be mortified if I could read that letter that I wrote him today, but I do have his response to me, and it sort of sheds a little bit of light upon what I was probably asking him. So I'm going to read you his letter to me. Dear Mr. Beckley, your letter doesn't say what your economic situation is. If you are not already wealthy, then I think a sensible preparation for farming or writing would be to prepare yourself to earn money in some other way. I think it is true of most writers that they do not make a living solely from writing, and the economic situation now makes it difficult for a farmer, much less an inexperienced person, to pay for a farm by farming it. So I suggest that you pursue some academic course that will equip you for remunerative work that you can do while living on and paying for a small farm. I'm sure you could learn valuable things from a College of Agriculture, but as you seem to suspect, you will need experience too. You might get help from the Maine Organic Farmers Association, located, I think, at Hallowell. Yours cordially, Wendell Berry. So I've been following his advice for the last 40 years, basically. I did take a year off of university after my first 2 years and did an apprenticeship on 2 farms, 2 organic farms in Maine. I got land fever then, and I was off on a 19-year journey until I found my way to New Brunswick and found my way to the 115 acres of land that I currently live on now with my partner, Louise. So I'll talk a little bit more about the work that I do and how the themes that Wendell Berry writes about has also influenced those. I didn't realize the extent of it until I was actually preparing for this little talk, but I've always been a little bit perplexed at this, like who the Wendell Berry fans are, and this was a moment maybe that showed that I was destined to become a professional sociologist, that would be the remunerative work that I would go for. You probably wouldn't have recommended rural sociology as a way to do that. But anyway, I finished at Bowdoin after my year away and then stayed on. I ran the pub there for a year and did work for a carpenter and boat builder for a year. And sometime during that period when I was no longer a student there, but rather a townie, one of my professors brought Wendell Berry to campus for a talk, and he invited me to this kind of after the talk cocktail party at his house, and it was one of the most hilarious things and kind of uncomfortable events that I had ever been to, because basically everybody that was there, were Icelandic sweaters and wool socks and Birkenstocks, and they were kind of like cool small town hippie back to the land types, and they just like it was all they could do to not get down on their knees before this man. And there's Wendell kind of wearing a brown polyester suit and a drab ugly tie, because that's what being dressed up looks like in rural Kentucky, and he was just trying to deflect all of this adoration by kind of telling off-colored barnyard jokes and being a very aw shucks guy. It was quite the thing to see, and I think it probably shattered some people's illusions of this wise man coming down from the mountain. But I think that's exactly what he was trying to do. I just wanted to bring up a couple of these controversies. When you develop a hero, sometimes it's important to look at all sides, and he's had a couple of sometimes silly, but sometimes interesting consequences too. I mean, one of them has to do with tobacco, because tobacco was the main crop that was grown on his father's farm, and I think initially on his farm as well. Ultimately, he got sheep, but he often was, and a lot of his novels that take place in that part of Kentucky too deal with people who were tobacco farmers. And so, since the 1960s, when he began as a writer, tobacco has kind of become a big, bad, and ugly thing. And so he's found himself sometimes in the position of defending tobacco as a legitimate crop to grow, I suppose. Another controversy came in 1988 when there was an article in Harper's Magazine that basically described his wife Tanya as his typist and editor, and it was a statement that he was making. I'm never going to buy a computer. I've got a typewriter, and my wife types my manuscripts, and they came down on him pretty hard for that as well. Without, I think, asking Tanya her opinion about it, but he had to do a little backpedaling there. So I just wanted talk for a minute about the influence that he's had on my life. Like I said, I heeded his advice. I became a professional, although I would say that I would react strongly if you tried to call me a specialist. Daniel was asking me what I was. And so, yes, I'm a rural sociologist. That was my master's degree. I would call myself an environment, natural resource sociologist now. But I'm also a committee member on my local service district advisory committee, and I'm a woodlot owner, and I'm trying to be a bit of an artist. And so like that passage that I read about being a specialist, that stuck with me, and I tried hard not to be a specialist, even though lots of times people want to put me in that box. But like I said, that dream of finding some land to steward and to make home came to fruition, and when I moved to New Brunswick 20 years ago, and I found a community as well that I've become active and participated in as well, which is what Wendell says you're supposed to do. And then this is the one that kind of surprised me when I was thinking about it, but his influence on my scholarship has been pretty dramatic too. So for one, I chose rural sociology as my discipline. My master's degree was on intergenerational transfer of dairy farms in 2 different styles among 2 different ethnic groups. But all of that was, my supervisor at the time was looking at family farms and kind of the virtues of family farms as opposed to like industrial dairy farming in the state of California. My dissertation, my PhD, was on forest-dependent community in Western Maine. And again, kind of the industrialization of nature and power relationships in that community, that internal colonialism with sort of wealth being sucked out of rural America into New York City and other eastern seaboard urban centers. Later on in my career, I started looking at sense of place. I've done a lot of research, primary research on sense of place and attachment to place. And that was going on while I was searching for my own land and my own community, my own place to call home. And then about, a decade after that, when I finally had land, I got very interested in, well, what are the land ethic of forest landowners? And we did that study in Sweden, Maine, and New Brunswick, interviewing landowners about, for whom or for what do you manage your land? Like, who do you consider in your ethical considerations in how you manage your land? And then I've also done work on pro-environmental behaviors, factors that contribute to it. And one of the innovations there that we did was we asked people not just where they live, but where they grew up, so where they were socialized. So we have a 2x2 table that has, city people that were born in cities and currently live in cities, rural people, but then we have these interesting people that were socialized in a rural place and now live in a city. People like myself who were raised in a city and now live in a rural place and are looking at more subtle differences between their environmental values, and kind of looking to see if there is a rural environmentalism, or when we're feeling silly, we sometimes call it, is there a distinct redneck environmentalism, and what does that look like? Recently, I think Wendell's had a significant challenge, and that is like today, since 2016, everybody associates rural America with Trump and Trump's America. And while it's largely true, I don't think it's the whole story. A lot of those Rust Belt cities throughout the Midwest, smaller cities, kind of tip the scales in Trump's favor. But Wendell has remained trying to represent a kind of progressive side of rural, and I think he still does it quite articulately. But again, I think this division in society, rural is always sort of seen as on the decline, as backward, and Richard Florida is, talks, it just drives me crazy when he talks about cities as these hubs of innovation, and that's the only possible place where innovation could happen. I really don't agree with that, and I'm myself a bit of a champion for rural most of the time. So I'm going to read one more passage, and this is from a book in 2017 called The Art of Loading Brush. Unlike Daniel, I haven't read every single thing he wrote because he writes about the same thing over and over again. I love this quote from the introduction to this book. He says, Tanya, my wife, says that my principal asked an author has been my knack for repeating myself. He said he found that was quite amusing and also accurate. But I do want to mention, like, whenever I have my students read Wendell Berry, and I have them read another chapter as well called The Whole Horse, which is kind of another definition of what agrarianism is, agrarian culture and agrarian thinking. They all react the same way. They all say, oh, Tom, we can't go back. There's never any notion that, kind of balancing our relations with nature is actually a way of going forward. And to do that by directly reestablishing relationships with land and soil and growing our own food. It's a big part of my life now with Louise Camon, who many of you know. We try to grow most of our own food even as we're getting older, and it's a bit more challenging to do that given our energy levels and so forth. But we don't consider it work. We consider it a lifestyle, and we're Louise grew up in Toronto. I grew up in Milwaukee, and we are born again agrarians, I guess you might say. But this is Wendell's definition in bullet points of what agrarianism is. After the following definition or characterization of agrarianism, as I understand it, like that: an elated, loving interest in the use and care of the land, and in all the details of the good husbandry of plants and animals. Number 2, an informed and conscientious submission to nature, small n, or to nature, capital N, and her laws of conservation, frugality, fullness, completeness, and diversity. The wish, the felt need to have and to belong to a place of one's own as the only secure source of sustenance and independence. The freed slaves who pled for 40 acres and a mule were more urgently and practically agrarian than the 12 white Southerners. I think that's a reference to these writers that he was talking about earlier in the chapter. From that to a persuasion in favor of economic democracy and a preference for enough over too much. Fear and contempt of waste of every kind and its ultimate consequence in land exhaustion. Waste is understood as human folly, an insult to nature, a sin against the given world and its life. Number 6, from that to a preference for saving rather than spending as the basis of an economy, of a household, or a government. An assumption of the need for a subsistence or household economy so as to live so far as possible from one's own place. An acknowledged need for neighbors and a willingness to be a neighbor. This comes from proof by experience that no person or family or place can live alone. So the community piece. A living sense of the need for continuity of family and community life in place, which is to say the need for survival of local culture and thus the safekeeping of local memory and local nature. Respect for work and as self-respect for good work. This implies an understanding of one's own life's work as a vocation and a privilege, as opposed to a job and a vacation. And finally, a lively suspicion of anything new. This contradicts the ethos of consumerism and the cult of celebrity. It is not inherently cranky or unreasonable. So, with that, I do think this guy occupies a very interesting space in North American culture, like, this kind of strong appeal to the liberal left. I don't think any of my rural neighbors, who are deep rural around here have probably read him. If I get brave enough and close enough to them, maybe I will suggest that they do. I would love to get their perspectives. Although Phil Tabor's presentation in our Rural Issues workshop a couple of years ago was just a beautiful, beautiful description of how Wendell Berry's writing inspired him to go back to his parents' farm in Hampton, New Brunswick, and make a go of, like, again, being a modern professional, but still living a rural life and respecting some of those rural values, I guess. So he's left-leaning, progressive, rural, old-fashioned, conservative in the most local and individual sense of that word. And again, I think that letter came to me September 8th, 1980. So exactly 20 years ago. And I'm thinking maybe I need to write him another letter. So thanks very much.
This video was published by the nbmediacoop.org in New Brunswick, Canada.